Welcome once again to the Claremont Review of Books podcast, a series of interviews in which we discuss the essays and reviews that are richest and merit the most further discussion from the latest issue of the Claremont Review of Books. I'm your host, assistant editor of both the Claremont Review of Books and the American Mind, Spencer Clavin, and my guest today is Professor Jim Hankins. Professor Hankins teaches at Harvard University. His area of particular focus is the Italian Renaissance, and his latest book is called Virtue Politics, Soulcraft and Statecraft in Renaissance Italy. But his latest essay in the CRB shows that he's got a very wide array of interest and of reading. He's written for us in this latest issue. The lead essay in this issue is on the topic of hyperpartisanship. Jim, it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much. I'm also enjoy the pleasure.
Great.
Share the pleasure. I share in the pleasure.
Fantastic. And as is our tradition over here at CRB, I've asked you what alcoholic beverage you'd like to share with me. So I remotely have poured out a Campari and orange. Did I get that right? And are you joining me from afar with that?
That's exactly what I'm drinking now, the Campari with an orange slice.
Fantastic.
As you can tell from my slurred speech.
Very nice. Well, it's a new one on me. I have to confess, I hadn't tried this particular cocktail. I'm a bit of a Scotch man myself, but I'm enjoying this addition to our chat. But I'll launch in and I'll talk a little bit about your essay before we begin to discuss it. As the title suggests, this is an essay about periods and trends of hyperpartisanship. And I'll actually let Jim define hyperpartisanship in his own words here as I read a section from his essay. He says, hyperpartisanship can be distinguished from normal democratic partisanship by certain features. Hyperpartisans live in bubbles, cut off from rival claimants to public authority by mutual incomprehension and mutual revulsion. They are dogmatic, intolerant, unable to sympathize with alien points of view. Opponents are demonized, their reputations destroyed by all means possible. Democratic deliberation becomes impossible, and political deal-making, the normal business of interest group politics in pluralist societies, is despised as an intolerable violation of principle. Politics is turned into a battle between non-negotiable demands. Compromise is impossible. The enemy must be crushed. Now, Jim, you begin this really wonderful essay with a quote from Joseph Addison, who's a British essayist around 1711. And he too talks about, he says, such a dreadful spirit of division as rends a government into two distinct people. And one of the strengths, I think, of your analysis here is that you point to an incredible range of periods in history, the era of Pisistratus in ancient Athens, for example, and then a number of other examples from history when a spirit of hyperpartisanship has taken over. I was wondering, in your own development as a thinker and as an observer of current affairs, when in American politics did you notice hyperpartisanship first begin to take hold?
Well, that's an interesting question. I think it was during the Clinton years, the late 90s, when there was all of the efforts, I'm sorry to say, on the part of the Republican Party to take out Clinton. Mm-hmm. And it seemed to me that we were already getting two distinct understandings of what politics was for and what politics was about, and we were already in that period dispensing with traditional political means for settling political questions, and instead trying to go to use the power of culture against each other instead of having rational discussion.
Now, that's very interesting, and it actually speaks to the next question I was hoping to ask you, because as I read your essay for the first time, I started to worry about my own bias because I read your description of the hyperpartisan, and I thought, gosh, this is a description of the modern progressive. And then I sort of looked back at myself and wondered, well, is that merely a feature of my own hyperpartisanship, that I'm unable to look at myself and ask whether I exhibit these features as well? But it also seems in your essay as if you mentioned that it was initially a kind of Republican problem, but it seems in your essay as if you locate hyperpartisanship most in the progressive movement at the moment. Is that so? And if so, why has the shoe moved on to the other foot in that way?
Well, I'm not sure that I would say it's all on the progressive side. I'm writing for the Claremont Review, where the readership is more likely to take that view. But I share your disquiet that one may be harboring hyperpartisanship in one's own heart.
Right.
And, I have to take extreme measures against my own prejudice to try to prevent the same kind of blindness and lack of charity that is necessary for. I'm very much helped by the fact that I have family members who are on the left, and whom I see from time to time, and several of whom I love very dearly as people, and they have very strong left-wing opinions. And when we get together, we're able to kind of argue things out and find some kind of middle ground. And the middle ground usually involves both of us changing our ideas slightly. But the key thing is that you have to have some kind of common ground. And what we don't have so much these days, partly because of the cultural bifurcation in America, is the possibility of common ground.
Can you speak a little bit more about the origin of that loss of common ground? Because it was a striking feature of your essay, and I agree, I find it much easier to relate one-on-one and personally with people I love who don't share my views than I do to relate to the public face of the opposing side. And I wonder what you think about how we lost our common ground, what our common ground consisted in, say, these many decades ago, and where it went.
Well, I think what Aristotle says is that we need to have friendships among the elite, right? That people have to be able to form friendships across party lines. There's a famous quotation, I think, of, I'm trying to remember the name of the British Prime Minister, who says that politics requires constant dining with the opposition. But you have to have some kind of social relations with people. And I think part of what's happening is owing to social media, where people are isolating themselves, that there's not the face-to-face relationship. And even if we're on Skype, which we're not, but if we were on Skype, the face-to-face relationship online is very different from what it is personally, because people don't like to hurt each other. It takes a kind of a particular personality to want to hurt another person. And I think when you're with people and you're looking them in the face, people want to be approved by the other person. But when you're in this empty echo chamber on Twitter or on Facebook or some other social medium, you are always tempted to flame the other person. There's something about social media, I suppose it's been analyzed by other more savvy people than myself, that depersonalizes the relationship. You don't feel you have the desire to be approved by the other person as strongly as you would. So you're flaming people down. The other problem, I think, the reason why I would blame the progressives more than the conservatives these days is because progressives really do want to control the culture in ways that the right could only dream of. It may be that the right, if it ever comes back and takes over and has an equal and opposite reaction, it's going to do exactly the same thing. I hope not. And that's one of the things I'm calling for in the essay, that we should try for balance and not for dominance. But I think that left really does have a project of dominance in the culture right now, which is making it more intolerant. And there is some data behind this. I don't know if you saw the article by Connor Friedersdorf in The Atlantic last month, but they actually did some surveys at the University of North Carolina. I don't remember the exact numbers, but there's something like a quarter of all progressives would not have a conservative as a friend. that they would refuse to be friends with someone who didn't share their beliefs. And the number is much smaller among conservatives. The conservatives are much more likely to have a liberal friend. I've been at Harvard for many years, and I've met many times undergraduates who say they have never met a conservative. For a fact that there's quite a number of conservatives, because they all take my classes,
Right.
but they just don't have contact with them, or more likely, the conservative students don't want to admit that they're conservative. They want to go along, get along, and get through Harvard and get their degree and go on to the next thing, and they don't want to take the chance of being destroyed in a Twitter storm, or being shunned by their fellow students, or something like that, losing a friendship. So they keep their mouth shut. And I think the result of that is that people don't debate. They don't take each other's point of view seriously. And so they end up in armed battles by night.
I'd like to return to this second issue of cultural takeover in a moment. I think that Friedersdorf piece that you cite was titled something like "Conservatives Really Do Self-Censor." And so the issue that you describe of self-censorship is hugely important. But let's first revisit the first point you made, which is about the form that our discourse takes, the way in which the digital revolution and our new modes of communicating with one another have just really warped and reshaped the way that we think about each other, that we don't get confronted with our fellow human beings in political conversations. That strikes me as a huge and hugely disorienting shift that's happened really quite recently. Even though this technology has been around, some of it, for some time, it's only in the last 10 years or so that I think it has really made itself the environment in which we live and the air in which we breathe. And since you're a scholar of political history and intellectual history, I was wanting to ask you actually whether you can think of any precedents for this kind of shift, this transformation of the discourse and of the means of communication, such that we find ourselves not more but actually less confronted with our political opponents as human beings.
Well, I think we're in a unique situation today historically. The closest thing I can think of it is to the era of in the era of the wars of religion, where you had politics being controlled by one religion or another, one heresy or another, depending on which side you're on, either by Catholics or by Protestants or by Calvinists or by Lutherans, that the governments were in the control of particular religious sects. So, and they were able to, or tried or aspired to stamp out the other religious sects, don't give them any airtime, to keep the borders shut. That was something people wanted to do in the period, to wipe out any kind of heresy inside the borders, to constantly propagandize their own people through the confessional and through catechisms. I mean, Catholic and Protestant regimes all tried to do this. They tried to control the printing press. There were, everyone knows about the index of prohibited books that existed in Catholic countries, but the Protestant countries did exactly the same thing. In Britain, for example, you had to be licensed to print anything, and it went through a censorship process. So there's certainly precedent for the idea that one should lock off one's community and keep it from being infected by foreign ideas. And that's ultimately where liberalism comes from in the late 17th century. The idea that one can't do that anymore, that governments should not be in the business of enforcing religions and forcing consciences. So, yeah.
How interesting that what you're suggesting, or what your analysis suggests, is that a move toward censoring your political opponents and mitigating the danger of their ideas by simply making them not heard is in some sense actually a move backward to a logic of religious censorship which predominated before liberalism. it feeds into a larger set of analyses that I have been reading and that we publish often here at Claremont about progressivism as a religion, that there are hallmarks of religious attitudes and of sacrificial purity mindsets and so on in the most extreme versions of radical identity politics. What I'm wondering as I hear you talk is whether you think that analysis would provide a useful lens through which to view hyperpartisanship. Do you think that hyperpartisanship has religious elements to it?
Oh yes, I think I'm in perfect agreement with that point of view. There is the danger, of course, that the conservatives can also fall into this kind of form of hyperpartisanship. But I think the real danger is on the left right now, partly because they are post-political, that they don't believe in politics as a way of solving problems. On progressive left believes in rule by experts. They have since the early 20th century at least. They want to settle all the questions on a kind of technical level, with policies being manufactured by academic social scientists and think tanks, not subject to political struggle and negotiation. They would like to settle all social issues in the courts, again, under the control of experts. Mm-hmm. They don't want to settle things in the public sphere and have debate, right? Environmentalism are always saying that it's settled science, right? Mm-hmm. That our choices in environmentalism should just be taken over by the scientists. We should simply follow them. But in fact, environmentalism is, well, what the environmental challenges of our time are is that there are a series of very hard choices, and those choices have to be debated democratically. We have to decide what is the best way to improve our environment. These things have costs as well as benefits. But modern liberals would be very happy to see elections, I think, abolished, or often scheming to control the outcomes or have them nullified when they don't amount to their liking. The elite likes to defend its position morally by appeal to false egalitarianism, the diversity and inclusion mantra, basically to conceal its own privileges. Mm-hmm. So I don't think that the progressive left is very open to political debate and to struggle in the way that has always been seen in the West as a mark of political life. In Aristotle, there's politics and there's monarchy. Those are the two options you've got.
Right.
And if you're going to have politics, you have to have people debate each other, and you have to take other people seriously. You can't treat them with contempt. This is something I think is very clear in the modern populist movements, that they're partly about the desire to be recognized, the desire to be included in the debate. It's not simply that populists feel that their ox is being gored, but they're simply not being recognized. They're not taken seriously. They're not allowed a voice. And their betters, or their soi-disant betters, the people who think they're their betters, want to decide for them. They don't trust them to make their own decisions. And that's extremely undemocratic, that whole attitude.
Yes, this begins, I think, to shade into the last, say, third of your essay and some of the cautions that you've issued today, but also in your essay to conservatives and Republicans, as we think about how we can push back against our exclusion or attempted exclusion from the academy and so forth. I'm going to read part of what you've written. Again, you say a little ways down, is there a way out for polities infected by the disease of hyperpartisanship? History, sadly, does not give us a great deal of encouragement. The usual way that polities exit from periods of hyperpartisanship is via war, revolution, or tyranny. And then, however, you go on to propose and to put forward this Italian principle of alternanza, which roughly translated, and you'll, I'm sure, correct me and translate it much better, but has to do with balance, with conceding certain things of value on both sides of a debate and an equation. And you also argue that conservatives have certain disadvantages in an attempt to take back the culture as it's often sort of simplistically described. One of them being that we are actually not ideologically invested in the kind of hostile takeover that, say, post-Marxist and radical progressive theory might welcome. And so I wondered whether you see going forward the best solution as conservatives attempting to make their voices heard within the institutions that are most embattled and most perhaps afflicted with hyperpartisanship, or whether you think some sort of move toward forming a new set of institutions, toward Renaissance in the more metaphorical sense, and creating smaller colleges that might host a plurality of viewpoints. Is one or the other of those approaches more appealing to you?
Well, I think we need a full court press. I always go back to Aristotle. Aristotle has essentially two approaches to solving partisanship. And of course, in the Greek city-states, especially in Athens in the 5th and 4th century BC, they had terrible problems of partisanship and factionalism. So they were very experienced at all this stuff. So Aristotle basically has a kind of ethical approach and a political approach. The political approach is to balance factions, so that in his view, what you do is you give, there are basically two factions. There's the rich and the poor. Mm-hmm. There's the people who want to be equal and the people who think they're better than other people because they have more money. And that what you have to do in the state is balance out their power. This is the same strategy, by the way, followed by Machiavelli later on. Mm-hmm. And so you want to give the people control over say the assembly, but then you want to have the good people or the educated people have control over the probolutic assembly, that is the small assembly that makes business that lays out the business for the large assemblies. You want to have courts. Courts in ancient Athens, of course, extremely democratic, but you want to have laws that are made by the wise to restrain the people in their foolishness. And there are various devices that you can use. For example, in warfare, you want to have election, because election, according to Aristotle, is not a democratic; it's an oligarchic principle, right? So, but the idea is that you're going to balance out elements in the Constitution. Now, what we do in modern democracies is we take turns parties take turns being in power. What alternanza is the Italian principle that you leave the apparatus for changing power untouched. Mm-hmm. So you don't booby trap the state when you leave office so that the other faction or the other party cannot rule. And you don't take advantage of your power while you're in power to take away all possibility that the other party could come to power. And it's a very delicate sense of political norms that we had very effectively enshrined in our Constitution and were respected for a long time. But now we're getting to this period when people simply don't accept the results of elections. They don't accept that their next task after losing an election is to win the next election.
Right.
The last election is win the next election. They want to reverse whatever the election is by extreme means or by resistance or impeachment and all of these very extreme measures and partly unconstitutional measures. So alternanza would be trying to keep the normal political means for exchanging power intact. So, and now I'm forgetting what the second part of your question is, but I remember what I'm thinking. Strategies for ending hyperpartisanship. So one strategy is to try to defend the norms of democratic government and to balance constitutional forces so that one party isn't able to dominate. Another suggestion I made in the essay is that in case of non-political institutions, businesses, colleges, foundations, that an attempt should be made to try to balance ideologically whoever controls those institutions. So what happens in most situations, if you have ideological balance in, say, a university department or in a board of a foundation or the board of a a business, large business, if there's balance, then you don't get politics. The minute that one side, one political faction overwhelms the other on a board or a department or what have you, then you get politicization. And like a good liberal, I think that we should have as little politics as possible. So that's another suggestion I have, is to try to limit what counts as political by balancing out ideologically institutions that are liable to be politicized. If we had corporation boards that were balanced conservative and liberal, you wouldn't have corporations becoming woke and siding with one faction or another in politics. And the same thing I see very often in my own department. Back when I entered the Harvard History Department, 1985, I would say at least a third of the professors were conservative, which sounds an astonishing thing to say today, but it's true. I'm not sure they ever voted Republican. That's really would be an extreme behavior, but
right.
But they were certainly conservative in terms of the academic mission of the university. They thought that the main thing was to write good history, that we should teach history well and write good history. Now, of course, we have all sorts of political goals in addition to those goals. And the political goals have come in because there's not any conservatives, except for me now, on in the Harvard History Department. There used to be Neil Ferguson helping me out, but he's gone off to Stanford, so I'm the last kind of open political conservative. I think there's actually a couple closeted conservatives in my department, but they're not getting out in front. But so my second idea is that you would try to balance politically institutions that are non-political. That would reduce the amount of politics in the culture, which I think would be a very good thing. Not everything has to be political. That's another area where we really disagree with the left. The left wants everything to be political. The feminists want the personal to be political, which I think is a disaster, makes everyone miserable. But this is a general principle. The left wants the choice of your socks to be political. They want you to be openly mocked in the streets for having the wrong socks on. And I don't think that's a good thing. And then, of course, the third thing I don't talk so much about in this essay, it's very long already, is the idea of common culture, which is something that's normally in sort of sociology and history recognized as a basis for shared political, the ability to have a politics. This is not a particularly right-wing idea. I think the most famous expositor of the idea of a common culture is Emile Durkheim, was a sociologist on the left, in France in the 1920s. He's writing. So, but I think that it's quite important to have a culture which has some kind of common culture, that we have something taught in high schools, and I'm a big supporter of public high schools, believe it or not, that we have public high schools that teach a common political culture and teach civics. I don't know about you, but I was taught, I had 2 years of civics when I was in high school, and was taught by someone on the left, but someone who nevertheless explained to us what the Constitution meant and what the various amendments to the Constitution were, the constitutional history of the U.S., and we had a good sense of what American political values were. But for some reason, we've not been able to do that in recent years. Whatever is being taught in high school is being very strongly inflected towards the left. They're learning radical environmentalism. They're learning radical feminism. They're acquiring a political point of view which is out of keeping with the majority of people in the country. And I think that has to somehow change, although I haven't really thought very deeply about how that could happen.
No, I think you put your finger there on one of the most important goals going forward. I was taught civics in high school, but I count myself among the lucky ones. As a 29-year-old, not many of my peers actually were taught civics, and as they say online, it shows. There's so much more for us to discuss. I would love to quiz you further about politics, book 3. I would love to ask you a little bit about Pericles, but we're going to have to leave that for another day because we've actually run out of time. Professor Hankins, thank you so much for this rich essay and for this conversation over Campari, and we'll hope to see you again soon.
All right. Thank you very much for inviting me, and I enjoyed tremendously talking to you.
Likewise, it was a pleasure. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Claremont Review of Books podcast. I'm your host, Assistant Editor Spencer Clavin. The podcast is produced by Jake Gannon. The Claremont Review of Books is published by Ryan Williams and edited by Charles Kessler. For more great Claremont content, you can go to www.claremontreviewofbooks.com or www.americanmind.org. See you next time.